Well, thank you very much. I'm very honored and flattered to be speaking to this very august audience about something that I don't think this audience need to be convinced of its importance, namely useful knowledge. So when I introduced the term into economic history a quarter century ago, I constantly ran into the question, what do you mean by useful knowledge? Useful to whom? Useful for what? What is useless knowledge? And questions of that nature. And I don't think Benjamin Franklin or his Scottish buddies, Adam Smith and David Hume, would have had posed the same kind of question. All right, so I'm going to pose this sort of $64 million question that economic historians always ask. How do we explain what is now known as the Great Enrichment? In other words, that we, basically the entire world with some regrettable exceptions, live at a living standard that is vastly higher than most of humanity lived for basically all the way to the early days of history. And this is something on which no audience needs to be convinced. The factors speak for themselves. But if you were to explain what is behind it, and in one word, I would say it's useful knowledge. And the reason for me saying that is actually not quite trivial. There are other ways in which economies can grow. Adam Smith, for instance, really felt that growth would happen through what he calls specialization, or what we call in economies the gains from trade. And other people like Douglas North would talk about institutions and things like that. But all these other forms, but useful knowledge, are known as, in what we would call in economies, the curse of concavity, which is a fancy way of saying that essentially these other things run into diminishing returns. And the only thing that has not yet run into diminishing returns, and may never, or it may, who knows, is actually useful knowledge. And so what is exactly meant in an operational definition of useful knowledge? And I would say basically there's sort of two components to it. I pinched this from the epistemologist. And essentially there is what I call propositional knowledge, which answers the question of knowledge of what, and prescriptive knowledge, which is knowledge how. And this is essentially recognized in the 18th century as sort of people who knew things, or savants, and people who made things, fabricants, or people. And so, now the interesting thing, of course, is that on the eve of the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century, of which I'll say more in a minute, there already had occurred something of a divergence between the West and the rest. So here's a quote from Samuel Johnson's Abyssinian Prince Raslas, who talks to this imaginary philosopher friend Imlach in 1759, which is on the eve of the Industrial Revolution. And he says, by what means are the Europeans thus powerful or wise, since they can easily visit Asia and Africa for trade or conquest? Cannot the Asiatics, I like the Asiatics, and Africans invade their coast, plant colonies in their port? After all, the same winds that carry them back would bring us hither. And the answer that the philosopher gave is, they are more powerful than we, sir, because they are wiser. Knowledge will always predominate over ignorance. But why their knowledge is more than ours, I know not. So that's basically the question that I sort of set to answer, and you'll see what I make of it. So one thing to keep in mind, of course, this knowledge was, at least as far as the long term is concerned, a reasonably recent event. If you look at the world in 1250s, in the middle of the sort of High Middle Ages, clearly Europe has no advantage over the three great Asian civilizations, the Islamic world, India, and China. Even as late as 1700, the difference in living standards between Europe and these Asian civilizations was probably not large. Measurement is tricky here, as you all realize, but by and large, most of the oomph in the great divergence between West and Asia happened somewhere between 1700 to 1750 and, say, 1914 or thereabout. So what drove the reversal? And so here is one way of thinking about it. The 18th century witnesses two crucial developments. Okay? One of them, of course, is the Industrial Revolution, which essentially started the move toward sort of, I think, the great enrichment, if you want, through technological change, of course, which is the net result of useful knowledge. The other was the Enlightenment. And changes the growth of knowledge in many and dramatic ways. And so it would, if you think about it, it would be a coincidence almost beyond belief that these two events, so momentous, occurring roughly at the same time and more or less at the same place, would be unrelated. But if you look at the historiography, you don't find it. You can pull out, at random 20 usually very big and fat books on the Enlightenment, and you look for Industrial Revolution in the index, you don't find it. Then you pull the same kind of books on the Industrial Revolution, you look about Enlightenment, nah, not even mentioned. And so I basically thought it would be unlikely that these things would be unrelated. But what was it about the Enlightenment that may have been a causal factor here? Well, it surely wasn't thanks to this guy. I see some smirks in the audience. This is, of course, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who not only, I don't really consider him to be an Enlightenment, but a counter-Enlightenment figure. But fortunately, there are many more thinkers who, disagreed with Rousseau in addition to not liking him personally, which was easy. So the segment of the Enlightenment is a huge tent, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, there are all kinds of Enlightenments, and I'm not going to deal with all of them. I have coined this new term called the Industrial Enlightenment, which is essentially, we also have, by the way, believe it or not, we have an agricultural enlightenment, we have a medical enlightenment, we have an artisanal enlightenment. These are all titles of books. But the important thing is that what the Industrial Enlightenment was about is a belief in progress. Now, what kind of progress, of course, you immediately ask me, and the answer is it's primarily material progress. That is to say, what we would call today economic growth. And their fundamental belief was that useful knowledge was the key to achieve it. So they already instinctively realized what I said, which is that is the way to attain sustained, perpetual economic progress. This is known as the Baconian program because, Francis Bacon was the first to sort of write this down. So here are 3 quotes. I'm not going to read all of those. That clock is sort of, look at me, threatening. But here you have 3 of the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, Joseph Priestley, David Hume, and Adam Smith himself, who basically said, look, they are all writing, roughly speaking, at the same time in the sort of 1770s. And they're all saying, look, we have experienced progress that we have never had before. And so this is something that became entrenched in Europe maybe 2 generations earlier. There's this famous querelle entre les anciens et les modernes, between the ancients and the moderns, in which people basically decided that, yes, we are better than previous generations. And the reason is, as Fontenelle and others realize, is that knowledge is cumulative. He said, we know what Aristotle knew, but he did not know what we knew. That's the source of progress. And so this sort of sense of inferiority relative to the wisdom of earlier generations that you can still see in many cultures, say in 1600, basically has melted away by 1700. And that's a key ingredient to progress, because you really have to think that you are smarter than the people who wrote textbooks 50 years ago, or for that matter, in the case of Aristotle, 2,000 years earlier. Okay, so that is critical. Now here is what's known as an engram, which Google provides, which is basically terms that appear in books. And you can sort of see the red one is sort of the knowledge and science. Maybe the green one is most interesting. You can sort of see that there is a sort of, this is all, only, by the way, only English books. You can do the same for French and German. You get it a little bit later. But the green one sort of tells you, well, that around the Restoration, that period, there is a rise in belief in progress. Then it sort of fades out a little bit. But at about a few decades before the Industrial Revolution, it starts rising, and it continues to rising. So people write about progress or improvement or betterment and terms like that. Now, of course, the Industrial Revolution was primarily, if not exclusively, taking place in Britain. And the question, of course, is does England have an Enlightenment? Now, for many years, I have to tell you, is that Francophone historians describe the Enlightenment as a French phenomenon, and Anglophone historians describe the Industrial Revolution as an English phenomenon. Now, neither of these statements are quite right. But there is, of course, a difference in nuance and tone among the French and the English or British Enlightenment. Also, the Scottish Enlightenment is different from the English one. The English Enlightenment is far less concerned about the relationship between ruler and ruled, between a just society, when what they're interested in is solving pragmatic, practical problems. And so I would say that the British Enlightenment is an enlightenment of nuts and bolts, of cogs and springs. Okay? Here's a quote from Roy Porter, a great historian of this period, which he says, it's pragmatism, it's a philosophy of expediency. How do we solve problems? How do we prevent coal mines from flooding? Or how do we measure longitude at sea? Or how do we prevent smallpox? These are the issues in which the British are concerned, rather than the kind of things that guys like Montesquieu are writing about. So, in order to deploy useful knowledge to foster economic growth, two phenomena, two things have to take place. The first, of course, you have to increase the amount of new knowledge by creating incentives for inventors or by people who improve things. And the other is that existing knowledge has to be made accessible so that people can use it and deploy it. And so the problem with incentives for creating new knowledge is something economists have known forever, right? So, Ken Arrow in his younger days wrote about it. Essentially, knowledge is a problem as an economic good because it is non-rivalrous. That means if I give you some of mine, I don't have any less, right? Unlike pizza, say. It is hard to exclude people. So if I tell you, I can't stop you from telling a third person, and it sort of spreads all over. And finally, there are what we call in economics substantial externalities, which I'm not going to talk about. But the industrial enlightenment, the 18th century, really recognizes this instinctively, even though they hadn't read Ken Arrow, and they support a plethora of incentives for inventors. So Britain is the first nation to have a well-functioning patent system. There's some exceptions to that, but basically that's the case. They give prizes, they give medals, they give membership of the Royal Society, something that you will all recognize, or the French Académie Royale. And in many cases, this conveyed higher social status. It isn't just economic incentives, ladies and gentlemen. It's higher social status. And in some cases, people really became celebrities and then were voted large pensions. The classic case is maybe that of Edward Jenner, who first, of course, formulated the vaccination against smallpox, but there are other cases in point. So here are some more honors and prestigious distinctions that this society gave, okay? There's the Copley Medal, established in 1736, the Rumford Medal in 1799, and of course things like academic chairs and other distinctions. Now, the main incentive, certainly until deep into the 18th century, is patronage. And many very successful intellectuals who contributed to knowledge got nice patronage jobs, not least of whom, of course, Isaac Newton himself, who became master of the mint, and Galileo, who became court philosopher in Florence, and so on and so forth. And some of these people become what we would call today celebs, right? So Isaac Newton was a celebrity at his time. His funeral was a huge deal in 1727. And, a century later, in some separate way, James Watt became a celebrity. All right, so those are incentives. Now I want to say something about access and access cost. Now, access is critical. And our Professor Mokyr talked about JSTOR, which is sort of a very good illustration of how access cost can be reduced. Now, to use economic useful knowledge, you need access. First and foremost, of course, because people need to know best practice science. In the 18th century, best practice science might have done less for you than some people would like to believe, but still, in some cases, it mattered. But you want to tell innovators and scientists, not just that they have to stand on people's shoulders, as Newton said, whose shoulders should you stand on, right? And then, of course, many inventions aren't really totally novel. They're more like recombinations and hybridization of existing knowledge, so you have to have access to it. You want to avoid duplication and dead-end research, which we all understand. And finally, you want to have things moving the other direction. So a lot of scientific research or propositional knowledge is driven by recognized technological needs of people actually in the workshops and on the fields. So in other words, what the Industrial Enlightenment really meant is a belief that the savant should communicate with fabricants. And that way you get sort of a positive feedback mechanism between prescriptive and propositional knowledge, which goes back and forth and eventually may lead to a never-ending cycle of technological progress, which was if that's the good news or the bad news, I'm leaving up to you. But, you know, and so the other thing that these people realized, and I want to spend a few minutes on that, is what we call the codification project. So here's the way to think about it. A lot of technological knowledge, or prescriptive knowledge, as I've called it, is tacit. That's to say, it's not written down. The way it's passed from generation to generation is that masters will tell their apprentices, well, this is how you bake bread, or, you know, make steel, or whatever, but it's never written down. Now, of course, that means that access to it is fairly limited, and so you want to have codification. And this actually turned out to be a major project in the Enlightenment. So the most famous example is that paradigmatic document of the Enlightenment, which is the Grande Encyclopedia. And so the Grande Encyclopedia is not just essays about, you know, government and morality and religion. It has things like this in it. So this is a pin factory that supposedly inspired the first chapter of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. But you can sort of see it actually goes into nitty-gritty detail of how this thing works, what parts you need, what instruments you need, and so on. Here's another one, far less known. This is the complete dictionary of arts and sciences, published a little bit before the Encyclopedia, and I put red circles around those things that clearly reflect to useful knowledge, like mechanics, hydraulics, anatomy, you know, things like that could come in useful in certain occupations. Here is one of the more notable ones. This comes out in France. This is the Description des Arts et Métiers, which was conceived by Colbert. You can imagine it took a century for this thing to come out. Well, time moves slower in the 18th century, I think. And this then, you know, after Colbert, it was run by people like Réaumur and other people. But it finally started to come out in 1761, and then I think they published about 80 or 85 volumes of them. You know, I read about 20 of those. Boring like hell. I mean, you can imagine. But this is, you know, what it looks like. This is actually, you know, the art of sorry. Oops. I'm going in the wrong direction here. There's a way of coming back, yes. Sorry. This is the art of locksmithing, right? So you can sort of see the fine detail. So, you know, this is how technical knowledge gets to be codified, and it's critical. So eventually, of course, textbooks starts coming out. Here you see two of them. This is the one on the left. By the way, these are all written for some reason by Frenchmen. The idea about the Industrial Revolution is that the British developed new techniques and the French wrote about them. So here are two examples. The one on the left is about coal mines, which there were very few of in France, and the one on the right is about machines. That's a little bit later, written by a man called Augustin Betancourt, and so on. So that's to summarize. I'm right in time. On time. So the Age of Enlightenment solved essentially two issues of the many ones that they confronted. One of them is how to incentivize the creation of new knowledge, and secondly, how to disseminate, diffuse it, reduce access costs, make it available to the people who could use it, and not just the ivory tower people who created it. Thank you.
Marvelous, and we even have a little bit of time. So questions? Yes, Howard?
Hi, thanks for Howard Gardner from Cambridge. Thanks for a very stimulating talk. I'm not religious myself, but whenever I hear big talks like this, I wonder about the role of religion. And you mentioned religion just once in passing. So I want to know whether, in England and France, it was the lessening of religion as being the organizing principle of life that made it somewhat different from Galileo, who saw that God didn't have all the answers, but you had the Vatican there. And if so, was the diminishing of religious priority the reason for these for these forward movements in England and France, or was it the other way around?
Well,
what do you think about that? Thanks.
Well, France, of course, is the French have always been very bad Catholics, I should say. They declare atheism to be the state religion in 1793, but even before that, there's a famous tale, probably apocryphal, in which David Hume, in one of his visits to France, he's sitting around at the table of the Baron d'Holbach, who was a well-known, shall we say, skeptical philosopher. And he says, it's very interesting. I really would like one day to meet a real atheist, because he always denied that he was one. Also, he did. And Baron d'Holbach said, well, monsieur, there's 18 people around this table. 16 of them are atheists, and 2 haven't made up their minds yet. It's not. I find it primarily. Put it this way: there are people who make major contributions to science and to some extent to technology, who were deeply religious. First, above all, of course, Isaac Newton himself, but also people like Robert Boyle, who was a Puritan, and later on people like Joseph Priestley, who was actually a man of the cloth, a vicar. And it's fair to say that there is one incentive, perhaps which I should have emphasized, and you're right about that, in which people do science in order to illustrate the wisdom of the Creator. Of course, that's what Bacon continuously stressed. But, as the 18th century goes on, and religion starts playing a lower and lower role in people's work, it's the connection, it gets looser. And I cannot stop myself from telling you this famous, probably apocryphal story about the great French scientist, one of the greatest of his age, Laplace. And Laplace wrote this magnificent book, basically full axiomatization of Newton's system, which he then presented to the Emperor Napoleon. And Napoleon says, "Sir, I've read your book," which is probably a lie. But what is the role of God in your system? And according to the story, Laplace replied, "Sire, I have had no need for that hypothesis." And so I would say this is still a religious age, but the Enlightenment consists in part of slowly separating people's metaphysical beliefs from their physical work. And that becomes important, because in nations where that was not the case, and where you still have a great deal of political power, say in the southern part of Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, the heavy hand of religious supervision, I think, probably slows down the growth of science and eventually that of technology, and some of these areas fall behind eventually economically. I don't think that's a coincidence.
I think there's a question here. Yeah.
Thank you.
Introduce yourself too.
I'm Lauren Grimm from Cambridge. Thank you for your informative talk. I think your argument would be strengthened if we could find a country that produces lots of useful knowledge, but doesn't technologically or economically benefit from it. Then we would have a way of asking, why does it happen in Western Europe and the United States if it doesn't happen this place? And I would like to suggest that that country is my specialty, Russia. Russia developed the first 4-engine aircraft in the world. It developed the first semiconductor in the world. It developed the first lasers in the world and won Nobel Prizes for it. It developed the first space program in the world. And yet in no case did any of these advances lead to economic and technological application. Let me just take the example of space. We, we all know that that Russia put up the first spacecraft, Sputnik. Now, what's the greatest commercial product that's come out of space? Telecommunications. You can't name a Russian telecommunications company that is dominant or has much influence. Russia has a pattern of producing a great deal of useful knowledge and getting no benefit from it. Instead, its economy depends upon the exports of oil and gas. Now, why? Now, I think that if you ask that question, why, you will find reasons that will deepen your argument. It has to do with the nature of the society in which that useful knowledge is produced. The economic and legal system, the tradition of entrepreneurship, the belief that useful knowledge is a good thing to be applied and commercially produced. You should take a look at the counterexamples to your thesis in order to strengthen your thesis.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more that I have left out, a myriad of factors that determine, why this becomes successful or not. And Russia is a striking case because what you're saying is mostly true, but I would beg to differ at least on the 25 years before World War I, in which Russia seemed to be moving in a direction of a more market-oriented economy, in which there was opportunities for entrepreneurs, surely supported by government officials like the famous Count Sergei Witte and people like that, and that the sort of downslope happens in conditions in which the market system either does not exist, as it is surely true in Russia after 1929, or the market system is so distorted by corruption and by bad institutions that entrepreneurship is, for all practical purpose, extinguished. And that, I think, is true in Russia. And I would never deny that the difference between, say, Britain and other countries, say the Ottoman Empire or Russia or other places that Spain, is that these things happen in a society, within institutions, that are conducive to the application of useful knowledge. It's not enough to just come up with the idea. You need to have an environment in which property rights are respected, contracts are enforced, the government will tax but not confiscate, and in which people are free to express their opinions without having to worry by the inquisitors knocking on their doors, to give you just a few examples. Okay? So this is a very partial story, sir, and I would never, and so if it was all of it, my book on the Enlightened economy wouldn't be 550 pages long. I mean, I deal with all those things, and I totally agree with you. Russia is a particularly interesting case because of its mixture of successes and failures. So, point well taken.
Question here, yeah.
Yes, hi, Jay Stiefel from Philadelphia. Franklin, of course, was both a savant and a fabricant, being a printer. When he founded the APS, in devising who should be members, he prescribed that there be at least one mechanic, somebody to build the scientific apparatus that the savant would need. In your experience in studying learned societies and other civilizations, Europe, whatnot, was this a model that was followed by anybody else? Your whole point about fabricants and savants working together.
Well, I'll give you another example if you want. Joseph Priestley, who discovered oxygen, but also invented erasers, rubber things that we use to erase pencils with. I mean, he was a practical man who also was a theoretical man. And there are many more examples like that. You look at the great Frenchman, René Réaumur, whom I mentioned briefly. So René Réaumur was a mathematician, actually trained especially in geometry, but he wrote books about incubation of eggs and how to make a paper out of wood. And 3 incredibly thick volumes on entomology, because farmers struggled with insects. So yeah, there were lots of people who combined both prescriptive and propositional knowledge in the same person. You want more examples? I can give you a dozen. But the point is, by and large, I think you can see a growing separation between the sphere of people who actually study nature in order to look, to discover phenomena and document natural regularities, and the people who come around and apply them. And if you look at, say, the history of steam powers, starting from 1680 all the way to, I don't know what, World War I or something like that, you see that very clearly. There's people like Pascal or many other physicists who discover the rules, and then there are people who actually build the damn thing, like Newcomen. And so the real question is, how does the knowledge flow from one to the other? And they know this, Jay, because there are meetings, some of them famous, some of them obscure, in which these people get together, none more famous than the Lunar Society of Birmingham, where people like, practical people, like James Watt, sit together with scientists such as Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles, and many others, who basically say, how do we do this? And the scientists say, well, we think you should try that. Most of that advice, actually, I must say, is useless. Because, chemistry doesn't exist, really, in the 1750s and 1760s. But what is interesting, ladies and gentlemen, is that industrialists believe this, and that they thought, look, we need to talk to scientists. So there's a correspondence between James Watt and his Scottish mentors in Edinburgh, Black and Robison. These were the two sort of professors of natural philosophy. And he asked them, can I do this? How can I do this? How much coal do I need to use to burn? What's the maximum temperature? This, that, and the other. Now, the answers that they gave are it's a hit and miss, I must say. There's another case in point, which I like very much. It's the great potter, Josiah Wedgwood. Everybody's heard of Josiah Wedgwood. Well, Josiah Wedgwood had, at some point, a problem which had something to do with glazing, and I'm not going to get into the details of that. But what does he do? Does he experiment? No, he writes a letter to the greatest chemist of his age, Antoine Lavoisier, in English, by the way, and says, I have this problem with glazing. Can you help me? Now, the answer of Lavoisier, if he ever answered, we don't know, because it hasn't been preserved. But you think about it. People who make things start realizing, gee, these guys know something. We should ask them. And that, you don't see this, ladies and gentlemen, in the Middle Ages. But what's worse, you don't see it in China. And I don't see it in the Islamic world. This notion that this is how we can make the world better. It's not that we should make it better. This is how we do it. And that it's still working for us. We're still living in that world that it created. And as long as we have that, economic progress can be sustained.
Thank you. Great.